So, the root problem, everybody else is coming in from the answer, how can we empower consumers to access the internet? That's the most common thing. Or, we're hackers, how can we have fun? I have sort of this political agenda that I want to do a wireless end, I want to do an end run, probably wireless, now wireless, but I want to do an end run around the monopolists, the regulatorium, and Congress. That suggests to me starting where the backbone is, because that's the only thing in the United States that's really open and competitive and low cost. So what we've come up with is locating what appears to be the biggest price discontinuity, and therefore the place we could start with the most likelihood that if we screw it up, we'll have a chance to try again until we get it right. And this is an example of what I regard as the most interesting discontinuity in the US. These are real actual sales to people I know from service providers within the last 90 days. On the right is a building at 111 Huntington Avenue in Boston where people purchased a 100 megabit committed information rate. That's not 100 megabits shared with anybody, but dedicated service, symmetric, for $700 a month. Just a few months ago, $7 per megabit per second. Now, if you are at one of the internet exchange points in Boston, there are about 6 of them, you can get bandwidth for less, $4 per megabit per second per month, down to $1.50 per megabit per second per month, depending on volumes and whether you negotiating skills and so forth. The thing on the left is a building that is 200 meters away, which a friend of mine, his IT director, purchased a 10 megabit Ethernet LAN, a virtual LAN circuit, from a third-party provider who had to get into the building over Verizon Copper, and they're paying $2,700 a month. That's a factor of 38 difference. Not, 50% more or 38% more. It's 38 times more money. And as we looked around, typically the difference between buildings that are sometimes only 50 meters apart could be at least 20x and frequently 30x. So there's this enormous price discontinuity, and if you look in the city of Boston, and this is true of any of the top 25 markets in the United States, there are a few internet exchange points where bandwidth is dirt cheap relatively, and then there are a certain number of buildings that are lit by competitive fiber, competitors each have their own fibers. The building on the right has level 3 above net, Cogent, Veroxity, Fiber Tower, Verizon, and Comcast. So they have 7 different companies have their own fibers into that building. The building on the left has only Verizon Copper. So that's the problem. There are about 100 buildings in Boston like the building on the right, and there are tens of thousands of buildings like the building on the left. So that's what we decided to go after. Looking around, there are some wireless ISPs, commercial for-profit ventures in Boston. Uniformly, and this is true in most other major urban markets, uniformly they are competing with the monopolist on service quality. That is, they put in professional stuff from rooftops, installed by professional people. They pay rooftop sort of cellular antenna prices per month, and they promise that they will be more reliable than Verizon. In fact, they actually succeed in doing that frequently. But they ride at 60 or 70% of the Verizon price umbrella. We wanted to do something radically different that would literally upset everybody. So we decided on two differences. One of them is short range, low cost, point-to-point stuff, Ubiquity for example, but not necessarily. And the other was a freemium business model. The idea of the freemium business model is we would give away a free service comparable to business DSL as an incentive for people to buy their own nodes, hang them in a window, power them up, and turn management over to us. Exactly what incentives are needed to get people to do that kind of investment is something we're going to work out in the pilot that we're starting August 26th. It's the install date for the head-end service. And then beyond that, premium services, which would be committed information rate or committed data rate services comparable to what in the U.S. is referred to as special access tariffs, except at 1/5 the price of the competitive people and 1/8 or 1/10 the price of what Verizon charges. The idea here is to be completely disruptive. I have a pretty picture at the end suggesting that we will collapse a $10 billion market to a $1 billion market in 10 years by taking all the revenue out of the incumbents. Whether we could do that or not is an open question, but that's what prompted me when I saw this session. I figured, well, gee, I know about mobile, I know about 3G core networks. I have never run a network like this. I need to come to Vienna and talk to people and so forth. I'm worried about the technology that we're counting on, but frankly, I think the main thing we're going to have to work out, which we're planning to do between now and January, are the incentives. There are a number of differences about what we're trying to do. First off, we're trying to go window to window and build long chains of radios, and we've simulated at the moment 5 radio links with microtik routers in between and managed to get 93 megabits per second DDP traffic over the chain with less than 2 milliseconds of extra latency per node. So it's conceivable that we can do something like this. At the moment, we have a cogent 100 megabit dedicated service being installed in some offices in the Hancock Tower, which is a tall office building, where we've done a deal with one of the tenants there, where we basically said, we'll give you 10 megabit committed information rate if you'll allow us to put this router in your closet and 4 radios in the window behind, in 4 different windows behind your heating system. We have Tent City is a public housing project in an expensive neighborhood about 300 meters away, and in exchange for giving them some bandwidth, we got use of their rooftop, which is an interesting place for us to play. The main thing, though, is we're going to target small and medium business. Basically, typical American business person, it could be a lawyer or whatever, they go to work in their office and they find that the internet connectivity in their office is worse than the connectivity at home. A very common effect. At home, they can at least get Verizon and Comcast competing with each other to deliver, 10, 15, 20 megabit shared access. At work, they might literally be sharing a T1 line, 1.5 megabits per second. I mean, it's really crazy. There are some problems here, though. We're talking about using microtik routers and ubiquity radios. Long term, I'm not at all concerned because 4 years from now, I know where the technology will be, and I will be able to come up with something that automatically aims itself. But right now, everything requires aiming, which means it requires a professional installation. So we went around talking to people who do that. If you interview all of the small, medium, anybody who's got less than 50 employees typically does not have their own IT department. They have outsourced it to somebody who does their computer repair and installs a security appliance and tells them what to do about ordering internet service. So we went and identified 32 of these outsourcing locally in Boston and started talking to them, and they universally love the idea because they're increasingly, because of unreliability of Verizon and how critical internet is for a lot of businesses, they're putting in dual internet connectivity. A typical sidewall security appliance has a bunch of LAN jacks on it or WAN jacks on it, and it can be configured for dual LAN failover or dual WAN failover or dual WAN load sharing, and that's becoming increasingly common over the last 2 years. So these guys look at us as a potential source of free backup or free load sharing, and several of them have expressed an interest in saying, basically, we put this in right now, you know, they'll have their $2,000 Verizon service and your free service, and if it works as well as you claim, we'll go over to buying something from you and we'll turn the Verizon down to business DSL at $150 a month. And, you know, route the traffic to you because if you really can operate, and you don't have to be on all the time, because as long as you have, you know, 98% operational, that's okay. We get better reliability by having two unreliable services than we would from one reliable service. And oh, by the way, Verizon, the incumbent, who promises this service level agreement, is not that reliable, and their service level agreement says that if we cause an outage, we will reimburse you for 1 day of your service for the month. So we will reimburse you, you know, $120 when we just caused a complete outage in your business and you lost how much revenue? So, you know, everybody considers the service level agreements to be jokes, and they view two sources as essential, and we appear to be viable as a second source initially, and hopefully as a primary source, with the incumbent becoming the secondary source. So, this is all theory. The goal here is to reach break even. We have to be able to sell enough premium services to cover our costs. Otherwise, we're just something that will never scale. I don't know about, I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of networks here, but looking at certainly all the networks that have started and stopped in the Boston area in the last 10 years, and there have been several, they've all depended on grants and or on enthusiasts, and the grants are not renewed and the equipment is obsolete 3 years later, and the enthusiasts go off to grad school, and there's been one network after another that started, you know, it started with RoofNet, but those guys went off and found Meraki, and, you know, Open Air Boston is an active thing in 2 small clusters, but they're tiny, irrelevant in size, and they don't have any money and they're looking for grants. So I'm looking for something that could change the face of the U.S., and to me that requires that we be able to generate enough money to be north of break even. At that point, we can scale. And anything less than that makes us just another irrelevant experiment. So, just a comment about, at the moment we're talking about using off-the-shelf components. It's part of a whole separate thing which I could talk about or not if people wanted to get into it. There is, in Wi-Fi silicon, we're getting double the number of radios per chip every 2 to 3 years. We started with 2x2 MIMO 3 years ago. We have 4x4 MIMO coming from the big guys today. We'll have 8 radios on a chip 2 or 3 years from now. That's just Moore's Law. But the interesting thing about the 11N spec and about a bunch of stuff that's rolling out this year is you can also do beamforming. And if you get up to 8 radios and you're doing beamforming, you can now connect a piece of mass market silicon that should be available 2 years from now to an interesting antenna and produce something which can steer a 30-degree beam over 150 to 180 degrees. At that point, we don't need professional aiming anymore. And here, most people are interested in tight beams because they want to go far. I'm interested in steerable beams because I don't want to have any professionals required. I want to make it so that you can buy an appliance that has a few radios, steerable beams, and you hang it in the window, turn it on, and it just works. And if you dust it and knock it, it doesn't matter because it re-aims. Yeah. So that's 3 years out, maybe 4 years out in terms of making it into an actual device. So for the moment, I can only serve businesses where I can incent third parties to do professional installations. 3 to 4 years from now, we can think about going further, moving out from the downtown core neighborhood. And 5 years out, I would hope to be changing the landscape further and further out from the center city. Our thought is to leverage as much open source as we can and fund people wanting to change things if we need adaptions by talking to open source developers about, gee, couldn't you do a contract for us to change this in this way we need? And our focus is basically small and medium business in Boston to start, and then across other U.S. cities, and then blow it out. And that's so. bunch of initial things which we've tested out, which we'll be installing at the end of the month. And that's the vision. On the left, there is a business, and this is just part of our addressable market, but in the United States there is something called special access tariffs. That's what the phone company charges for T1, T3, OC3, what have you circuits. If you look at that business in just the top 25 urban areas, not the middle mile and the countryside and so forth, and you look at 2008, it was 10.5 billion. My goal is within 10 years to turn that market into a less than $1 billion market to own a piece of it. So I guess the reason I came was I was interested in community models and incentives for people to participate in things. I thought the most interesting thing I heard yesterday was the Wi-Fi network, the Catalonian network, where the presentation started out talking about return on investment and business models of affiliated people and why were people doing this. That's the piece that I want to understand. And how it might relate to the incentives I need to persuade people to join, to make it clear, So that's why I wrote the abstract and ended up in this position. Not being up here in front of you when I, in fact, was coming looking for information from you guys.
Okay.
Absolutely. Unless there's like questions, short, yeah.
How is the installation in the Hancock building paid for, and how much does it cost?
The head ends we're paying for. If you look at the business model, that's the monthly depreciation over 24 months of the equipment being installed in the Hancock. Maybe that's 36 months, and everything else. That's some lumpy figures there, but basically this is the monthly cost based on the stuff we have to install and depreciate over less than 3 years.
What's the actual?
There's a Microtik RB 1100 router and an APC UPS power supply, and there is we're paying for the installation of Cat 6 cables through the ceiling to the points where the 4 radios are going, and that's going to cost $750. There'd be about $2,500 to $3,000 worth of cost. So we need to recover the cost of the actual bandwidth, the cost of the equipment at the head end, and something, some extra fluff thrown in there. It's all very approximate.
But what's your protection against when the building owners and the property investment companies wake up to what you're doing, realizing that they can do it cheaper and undercut you even faster than you are?
We're talking about America here. We're talking about America here.
Yeah. That's not what I'm worried about.
And bring it on, because then
I mean, that's my goal. I mean, if somebody else does it better than me, that's fine.
No, they're so slow to bring it on. It isn't gonna matter.
My guess is if we are fabulously successful, we will be beginning to be noticed in 5 years. And my model is actually Craig Newmark, famous for Craigslist. He's been in business for 15 years now, but he started with something that is literally no barriers to entry for anybody to compete with him. And after 5 years, he was gradually propagating across, and they went slowly. They added, 3 cities, and then 14 cities, and then 5 cities per year. They didn't like blow it out across the country. And in each market, they gained critical mass. 5 years later, they began to get noticed, and 10 years later, people woke up and said, oh, gee, they accidentally destroyed the newspaper industry. So 10 years later, they can wake up and say, oh, gee, these guys, maybe they didn't destroy the incumbent, that'll never happen, but they sucked a vast amount of the unconscionable revenue out of the business.
And the capital requirements of your plan are such that you haven't got to go to external investors. Because that's the problem I had with Brough in 1989, which was to be a dark fiber, exactly the same model as this.
The goal here is
When
to...
I got the Fidelity in,
No, no,
He said,
yeah.
shit, I don't want to collapse it down to,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
I'm going to ride with the parasite.
I know. There are already plenty of parasite wireless ISPs trying to ride under the Verizon price umbrella. Our goal is to do something very different, where we're trying to incent, I mean, we have to be able to incent people to purchase their own nodes. Most of our network cost has to be contributed by the people who are getting the free service. I mean, it's not free, they have to buy a node. Now, the node hardware cost of piece parts today is under $300. On the other hand, the installation might be $500. 5 years from now, the node cost should be less than $100, and the installation should be anybody can do it just by hanging something in the window. So I don't know. I mean, this is the issue about incentives that we're going to try and work out between now and January.
Okay, I'm gonna